Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 5, Chapter 17, East or West. The end of the year and the severities of winter closed what has been called the second round of the struggle. In the west after the Battle of Ypres, in the east after the Battle of Lodz, the fronts became stationary in close contact behind ever-growing entrenchments. Sovereigns, statesmen, and commanders on both sides surveyed the ghastly scene, weighed the results of all the battles, and set themselves to plan the future. An immense feeling of relief inspired the leaders of the Allies. The terrific onslaught of Germany upon France had failed. Time would now be given for the whole armed strength of the British Empire to be brought to bear. The naval victory of the Falkland Islands had exterminated the German cruiser warfare. The British command alike of the oceans and the narrow seas was absolute. Very large surplus naval forces released from the cruiser warfare came back into the hands of the Admiralty. The blockade of the enemy empires was complete, and its pressures began to grow. Different indeed were the feelings with which the German chiefs measured the past and faced the future. They had no illusions upon the results which had so far declared themselves. Although their armies stood almost everywhere on conquered soil, and they disposed of enormous and still growing resources, they cast about earnestly for some means of escape from the deadly toils into which they had incontinently plunged. The causes of British and French satisfaction were perfectly appreciated by them, and struck a knell in their hearts. To the problems of their generals the German Chancellor and Foreign Office now made an unwelcome contribution. All hopes of inducing Italy or Romania to join them had long vanished. On Christmas Day, Count Czernin, Austrian ambassador at Bucharest, had declared to Conrad that Italy and Romania would enter the war upon the side of the Entente, unless the Central Empires could achieve a far-reaching victory by the spring. Italy was pressing with increasing plainness and slowly unveiling menace her demands for grievous cessions of Austrian territory. Romania seemed to be keeping step with Italy, and a hostile declaration by both powers might well be simultaneous. It became obvious that the attitude of the Balkan states was of decisive importance. Turkey, the one new adherent, had been defeated in the Caucasus and was already in internal stress. No military communication existed between her and the Central Powers. Serbia had not been defeated. On the contrary, she was triumphant. Bulgaria had not been won over. Greece was adverse, and Romania refused to allow the transport of munitions to Turkey. Already on December 14, General von der Goltz had written from Constantinople to Falkenhayn that the decision of the whole war rested with the small Balkan powers. Their by no means negligible forces and influence might turn the scale either way. It was evident to the German Foreign Office that the whole of the Balkan states and Italy might come into the war against the Teutonic and Turkish empires. This would involve the speedy collapse of Austria-Hungary, the destruction of Turkey, and the final fatal isolation of Germany. All this pointed to the strongest action against Russia, to the imperative upholding of Austria, and to opening direct access to Turkey. To the east must the Germans go. Conrad on December 27 telegraphed to Falkenhayn. Complete success in the eastern theatre is still, as hitherto, decisive for the general situation and extremely urgent. Rapid decision and rapid execution are absolutely necessary if the intervention of neutrals, which is certainly to be expected at the latest at the beginning of March, is to be forestalled. Hindenburg and Ludendorff reinforced these claims by arguments of their own. And here we must note a real and only partly unconscious cleavage of interest and opinion which opened in the German Supreme War Control. The German generals who had fought in the West had, since the French had turned at the Marne and begun to use their artillery and rifles, met with no success. And in war, which is always unfair, lack of success is serious. They had been unpleasantly surprised by the obstinacy of the French in defense. They had not believed them capable of such unsensational stubbornness. They were even more astonished by being forced to take the British army seriously. They now realized that they were in the West confronted by troops and military organizations of the highest order. The German generals in the East, on the other hand, had gained splendid victories. There were no trench lines, no high-class riflemen, few machine guns, and only a comparatively weak artillery. There was the opportunity for maneuver, and for that large kind of tactics of battlefield strategy which manifests itself through the adroit use of a superior railway system. In the East great victories had been won, with hundreds of thousands of captives, and whole hostile armies destroyed, as the result of what were undoubtedly finely conceived maneuvers modelled upon the classics of war. All Germany shone with the glory of Tannenberg. The Supreme Command, which had been thankful to see the failure of the Marne thus masked, now found with some disquietude that they cut a less impressive figure in the national eye than the triumphant warriors of the East. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, while comporting themselves with decorum, met in conferences men who, though in a superior station, bore the taint of failure. But the Supreme Command, with its galaxy of generals and staff officers, albeit discomfited, held nearly all the machinery of the German army and 5/6 of its strength. Patriotism, public service, military discipline, personal courtesy spread their emollients upon the sore places. Still, the underlying facts remained, and the East said in unspoken words, "Why don't you let us go on winning the war for you?" And the West replied by thunderous looks. "Win the war? Why, you have only been collecting Russians." Even now the German Supreme Command had not divided the rude fact that they were in the presence of an enormous inherent superiority of the defensive. At this time in the West, that is to say between armies of equal quality and in a theatre with closed flanks, the offensive could make no headway. Once the war subsided into the trench lines and barbed wire, the advantage of the defenders was overwhelming. The attacking troops had not got at this time the weight of artillery necessary to pulverize the trenches. Still less had they the volume of artillery capable of lining the whole front, so that an attack on a great scale could be launched on any one of 3 or 4 different sectors. The offensive, therefore, could not acquire the virtue of surprise. They had no tanks to crush down the barbed wire. They had not yet developed poison gas. Even the creeping barrage was unknown. In short, the offensive possessed none of the processes or apparatus capable of making headway against a continuous line of bravely defended trenches supported by the ordinary artillery of a field army, reinforced by many fortress guns. Falkenhayn did not understand this, nor did Joffre, nor did French, nor Foch, nor apparently any of the high military officers on either side. But it remained for several years the dominant fact in the Western theatre. With the armies matched as they were, no means of advance was open. Falkenhayn throughout took the conventional military view and adhered to it with perseverance. He did not believe that any maneuvers in the East would end the war. He had already reached the conclusion that so long as France, Russia, and Great Britain held together, it was impossible to beat them sufficiently to attain a decent victory, and Germany would run the danger of being exhausted. At this moment he sought nothing from Russia or France but an indemnity. He was no longer fighting for victory, but only for honorable escape. If, in order to find peace, Germany had to continue the war, the best chance was to press the struggle in the West. He was already busy planning a renewed offensive mainly against the British. 4 new army corps would soon be ready in Germany. In January or at the latest in February, His whole available force would be hurled upon the northern sectors of the Anglo-French lines. Hindenburg and Ludendorff met him foursquare in opposition. They were sure that the war could be won and ought to be won by making great efforts in the east, and that unless these efforts were made, it would be speedily and irretrievably lost by the apparition in the field of the armies of a Balkan bloc, and a separate peace by Austria. Conrad and the Austrian headquarters reiterated these views with desperate energy, and now all the forces of high politics and diplomacy ranged themselves upon the eastern side of the argument. The Chancellor and the German Foreign Office, rightly terrified at the prospect of Italy and a Balkan bloc being added to the hostile coalition, joined themselves to the victors of Tannenberg, the great twin brethren of the East. The West has failed, the Schlieffen Plan is burnt out. Smash Russia, hold Austria up, crush Serbia, rally the Balkans and join hands with Turkey. Thus arose a grim trial of strength between personages and policies of the highest consequence. On New Year's Day, Falkenhayn and Conrad met in Berlin. Ludendorff, representing Hindenburg, was also present. Tense discussions occupied the day. The conflict of wills and opinions rendered the conference abortive. Writing of it in after years, Ludendorff says that he received no clear answer and in effect that Falkenhayn adopted dilatory tactics towards Conrad's demands. It was all unsatisfactory and unmeaning. It was a contest of opinions settled beforehand. On January 2, Falkenhayn confirmed his decision. He telegraphed to Conrad, who had returned to Teschen, that the Kaiser agreed that troops could not at present be moved from the western to the eastern theatre. It would be time enough to settle the destination of the new troops now being raised in Germany in 3 weeks, and the next day he informed Hindenburg that to earmark the new formations for the east would be equivalent to renouncing all activity in the west for as long as could be forecasted, with all the serious consequences which that would entail, and these must not be lost sight of there. Hindenburg thereupon took counsel with the Chancellor, and the latter, deeply impressed, proposed to the Kaiser Falkenhayn's removal from the Supreme Command. On January 4, Conrad received a report from his military attaché in Rome that Italy was making all preparations to enter the war against the Central Powers, that the Italian army would be ready at the end of January and fully ready by the end of March. Berchtold, from Vienna, emphasized this formidable news and urged a speedy victory in the Carpathians as the only means of averting the peril. On this, Conrad ordered the preparation of an offensive in Galicia and telegraphed both to the Supreme Command and to Hindenburg and Ludendorff for the aid of 4 or 5 German divisions. Falkenhayn refused. He would not send troops from the west to the east, nor was he even willing that Hindenburg should send German troops from his own army to aid in an offensive in the Carpathians. If any troops were sent from the 9th Army, they should go to Serbia, rather than the Carpathians. Romania's attitude, Bulgaria's possible accession, and the extraordinarily important question of establishing communications with Turkey are exclusively dependent on the situation in Serbia. He added pointedly that, in the view of the German diplomacy, Italy could only be kept quiet by satisfying her wishes as soon as possible and not by driving the Russians out of the Carpathians. To this Conrad retorted that the satisfaction of Italy was not to be thought of, and would it not be better for Germany to satisfy France, presumably in Alsace-Lorraine, and thus break up the entente. On this, Hindenburg and Ludendorff struck a decisive blow. They informed Berlin that they were in full accord with Conrad, and that they had already, without consulting Falkenhayn, promised to send several divisions to his aid. This independent action was a challenge of the first order to Falkenhayn's authority. Both parties now clutched at the Kaiser. Hitherto he had stood by his new chief of the staff, who was still also Minister of War. But the pressure had now become irresistible. The dismissal of Hindenburg and Ludendorff was impossible. All Germany would stand behind them. On January 8, the Kaiser decided in favor of Conrad's Carpathian plans and ordered the formation of a German Southern Army, the Südarmee, under Linsingen. Falkenhayn, compelled to submit, was nevertheless strong enough to accept an important condition. He did not intend to be further surprised and defied by the Hindenburg-Ludendorff combination. He was resolved to break up the tremendous partnership which had already altered the center of gravity of the German war control. He therefore obtained the Kaiser's assent to Ludendorff's appointment as chief of the staff to Linsingen. This invidious act was wrapped in a flattering reference to the Kaiser's special confidence in Ludendorff. But the motive was obvious. Hindenburg, deeply aggrieved, reported on January 9 directly to the Kaiser, saying that the success, which he now expected in the Carpathians, would be by no means an adequate cure for the difficulties of Austria. It must be combined with a decisive blow in East Prussia. 4 new army corps will be ready at the beginning of February. The employment of these in the East is a necessity. With them it will not be difficult quickly to inflict on the enemy in East Prussia a decisive and annihilating blow, and at last to free entirely that sorely afflicted province and to push on thence with our full force to Bialystok. I regard this operation, with the employment in the East of the newly raised forces, as decisive for the outcome of the whole war, whereas their employment in the West will only lead to a strengthening of our defense, or, as at Ypres, to a costly and not very promising frontal push. Our army in the West ought to be able to hold well-constructed positions, sighted in successive lines, and to maintain itself without being reinforced by the new corps, until the decisive success in the East has been attained. He concluded with an impassioned appeal for the return of Ludendorff. Your Imperial and Royal Majesty has been graciously pleased to command that General Ludendorff should, as Chief of the General Staff, be transferred from me to the Southern Army. During the days of Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, during the operations against Ivangorod and Warsaw, and in the advance from the Vreshin-Torn line, I have grown into close union with my Chief of Staff. He has become to me a true helper and friend, irreplaceable by any other, one on whom I bestow my fullest confidence. Your Majesty knows from the history of war how important so happy a relationship is for the course of affairs and the well-being of the troops. To that is to be added that his new and so much smaller sphere of action does not do justice to the General's comprehensive ability and great capacity. On all these grounds I venture most respectfully to beg that my war comrade may graciously be restored to me so soon as the operations in the South are under way. It is no personal ambition which leads me to lay this petition at the feet of your Imperial and Royal Majesty. That lies far from me. Your Majesty has overwhelmed me with favor beyond my deserts. And after the war is ended I shall retire again into the background with a thankful and joyful heart. Far rather do I believe that I am fulfilling a duty in expressing with all submission this request. Meanwhile, Falkenhayn had decided to attempt a personal settlement. On January 11 he reached Breslau and there met Conrad, Linsingen and Ludendorff. On the 12th he was at Posen and faced Hindenburg, supported by Ludendorff and Hoffmann. These discussions only aggravated the existing differences, and an intense personal and technical crisis arose in Berlin. All centered upon the Kaiser. Hindenburg now openly joined the Chancellor in demanding the dismissal of Falkenhayn, the employment of the 4 corps in the East, and the reunion of Ludendorff and Hindenburg. The Kaiser, by the German constitution supreme warlord, had to choose. He did not, on this occasion, fail the German people. He decided against Falkenhayn. The 4 corps were ordered to the East. Ludendorff, after organizing the Südarmee, was to be returned to Hindenburg, and Falkenhayn was forced to resign the Ministry of War. In spite of these wounding blows, Falkenhayn was found still willing, with a heavy heart, to remain Chief of the Staff of the armies. Thus smitten in the foundations of his power, he nevertheless continued in the highest military office for nearly 2 years. He nursed for a time the idea that he himself might take command of the eastern operations. Rebuffed again in this, he contented himself with a scathing commentary upon them. He doubted altogether the possibility of bringing to a combined result 2 decisive undertakings separated by a thinly held gap of over 600 kilometers, for which only limited forces were available. He anticipated no more than fairly large local successes in the Carpathians and in East Prussia. In this he was to be vindicated by the event. His authority had, however, received a mutilating blow, and henceforth there were 2 rival centers of power in the German army. The severity of the war had already worn down the frail personality of Berchtold. The failure of Podgorek in Serbia had deprived him even of that local satisfaction he had purchased so dearly. The prospect of Italy joining the foes of Austria and adding a new front to the task of her crumbling armies was a strain beyond his nerve to bear. He who had been so rash and resolute in the crisis was the first to falter in the struggle. Tisa, on the other hand, who had pleaded for caution and peace while time remained, now showed the stern strength of his character. Undismayed by events, he strove to infuse resource and energy into the leadership of the empire. He resolved that Berchtold should give place to a more determined figure. The change was effected with an ease and politeness, with an absence of irritation or excitement thoroughly typical of the diplomatic circle in Vienna. On January 11, Tisa and Churchill lunched with Berchtold. The German ambassador as usual pressed, and this time with harshness, that Austria should buy off Italy at all costs with territorial concessions. Tisa made it plain that this could not be done. After a long discussion between the 3, Tisa found himself alone with Berchtold for a few minutes before his audience with the emperor. "I told him," he records, "that I should be obliged to say to His Majesty that at the present moment I considered that the post of Foreign Minister should be occupied by a man of greater decision, who followed out his own policy with more consequence and energy." Berchtold replied, smiling, as was his custom, like a good child, "I shall be very thankful if you really do say it, for I am always saying it, but he won't believe me. He will believe you." Not disarmed by this engaging demeanor, Tisa repaired forthwith to the palace and proposed Berchtold's immediate dismissal to the emperor. Francis Joseph did not demur. He had often, he remarked, thought the same thing. After Tisa had explained that he himself could not leave his post as Hungarian minister and president, it was arranged that a man of the bureau, a protégé of Tisa's, Baron Burian, should take charge of the foreign policy of the empire. On January 13, Berchtold quitted the Ballplatz and retired tranquilly to his estates, where he resides to this day. "Leave me in peace," he protested naively in 1916 to a friend. "I got sick of the war long ago." We have witnessed the birth convulsions of the German plans for 1915. We shall presently follow their varied fortunes in the field. No one can now doubt that the decision wrung from the Kaiser, for which he deserves due credit, was right. The year that opened so darkly for Germany was to be for her most prosperous of the war. In Artois and Champagne the French, at Neuf-Chapelle and Loos the British, were doomed to wear themselves out upon the barbed wire and machine guns of the German defense. With the loss of all her fortresses, Russia was to be driven out of Poland and Galicia. Bulgaria was gained as an ally by the Central Powers. Serbia was invaded and for a space annihilated. Greece was distracted and paralyzed, while Romania was awed into a continuing neutrality and Italy was left to break her teeth on the Isonzo. The German road to Constantinople was opened and Turkey, saved from destruction, fought on reinvigorated. To observe the other side of these surprising transformations and mighty achievements, we must now repair to London. The attention of France was riveted upon the invasion. All French energies and thought were absorbed in the life-and-death struggle, which for the moment had slackened, but must soon be renewed. Joffre, victor of the Marne, and his Grand Quartier Général, GOG, dominated the scene. France was hardly conscious of other scenes. Russia, Austria, and the Balkans, all these were noticed only as a swordsman in the climax of a duel observes his second or the spectators. To strengthen the French army, to hold the front in France, to liberate the 13 conquered departments from a hateful yoke, these were the war plans of France. But in London, where the pressures were not so severe, a more general view was possible. A small group of men at or near the summit of the war direction had been for some weeks gazing intently upon the same Eastern Front, which was the subject of these lively discussions in Berlin. The reader, with all the facts laid bare before him, must also realize how difficult it was in the Cabinet or at the Admiralty and War Office to learn and measure the facts and values of the episodes which this volume has already recorded. We had been absorbed in securing the command of the seas, in sending the British army to France and keeping it alive under the terrible hammer blows which it endured, in gathering together the forces of the empire, and in mobilizing for the struggle all the wealth, influence, and manhood, not inconsiderable in any quarter of the globe, on which His Britannic Majesty could make a claim. The French told us little except their wishes, and the Russians less. We had sustained generally the impression that Russia had defeated Austria in a great battle called Lemberg, and that Germany had successfully defended East Prussia. We had the feeling that the Russian steamroller, which the Western powers had expected, would smooth the path to victory, was moving backwards as well as forwards, as is indeed the habit of steamrollers. But the full significance of Tannenberg was only gradually understood. Like the French, we were in contact with immeasurable events and occupied from hour to hour with vital details. Masses of information were provided in the intelligence reports. Every day there lay upon my table 20 or 30 flimsies recording the ceaseless movement of troops to and fro across Europe and every kind of rumor, true or false. From the Admiralty we asked the War Office repeatedly for general appreciations. But all the British General Staff had gone to the war, and had been entirely preoccupied ever since in keeping together the body and soul of the Expeditionary Army. No adequate machine existed for sifting, clarifying, and focusing the multitudinous reports. Lord Kitchener, calm, Olympian, secretive, and imperfectly informed, endeavored in these months to discharge in his own person the function of Secretary of State for War, Commander-in-Chief, and of the collective intelligence of a General Staff. Yet somehow things had not gone wrong. The seas were clear. The island was safe, the army had reached its battle station, the front was held, the empire was forming in the fighting line. Therefore there was not at this juncture any very decided questioning of our impressions acquired from day to day, nor of our primitive methods of war control. Indeed, up to the end of 1914 we were, I feel, entitled to be proud of our conduct of the war. All our ships and men were being used to the full and in the right way. No more elaborate organization would up to this point have produced better results. But a change had now come over the war. Its scale and complications grew ceaselessly, and we now had broadening surpluses of men and ships to employ. Here was the question which demanded scientific study. Once we felt supreme and safe at sea, we looked almost instinctively to Turkey, Russia, and the Balkans. During the whole of December, Colonel Henke, Mr. Lloyd George, and I, working at first independently, became increasingly interested in the southeast of Europe. After the war had been declared, diplomacy counted little with neutrals. They were no longer concerned with what was said or promised. The question they asked themselves were, what was going to happen, and who was going to win? They were not prepared to accept British assurances upon either point. We were astonished to find that many of these neutrals seemed to doubt that Great Britain would certainly be victorious. One pitied their obliquity. But they persisted in it. The Foreign Office talked well, but it was like talking to the void. However, by the first week in December, we three all separately reached the conclusions that the Western Front had frozen into a deadlock, that whoever attacked would get the worst of it, and that a great diversion or turning movement, diplomatic, naval, and military, should be made through and upon the Mediterranean powers. Little did we know how closely our thoughts corresponded to the preoccupations of Berlin or to the conclusions of Hindenburg and Ludendorff. Behind the hostile fronts all was mystery. Behind the Allied fronts, concerted action or machinery for such action was as yet in its infancy. On December 29 I wrote to the Prime Minister as follows. I think it quite possible that neither side will have the strength to penetrate the other's lines in the Western theatre. Belgium particularly, which it is vital for Germany to hold as a peace counter, had no doubt been made into a mere succession of fortified lines. I think it probable that the Germans hold back several large mobile reserves of their best troops. Without attempting to take a final view, my impression is that the position of both armies is not likely to undergo any decisive change. On January 1, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Mr. Lloyd George, circulated to the War Committee a paper drawing attention to the unfounded optimism which prevailed about the war, to the increasing failure of Russia as a prime factor, and to the need for action in the Balkan Peninsula, in order to rally Greece and Bulgaria to the cause of the Allies. On the same day, Colonel Henke circulated a masterly paper pointing to the Near East as the decisive theatre for our immediate Allied action. These documents had been shown to me some days earlier, and on December 31 I wrote to the Prime Minister, Mr. Asquith, about them, saying, "We are substantially in agreement and our conclusions are not incompatible. I wanted Gallipoli attacked on the Turkish declaration of war. Meanwhile, the difficulties have increased." On January 3, after continuous daily discussion at the Admiralty and with the Prime Minister, Lord Fisher wrote me a letter, already printed in the second volume of the World Crisis, in which he declared, "I consider the attack on Turkey holds the field, but only if it's immediate." There is no doubt that had we known, as we know now, the nature of the discussions proceeding in Berlin, some plan of this kind could and would have been converted into coherent action. We had among ourselves divined the secret of success. Could we have obtained one commanding decision on the fundamental issue, and had there been a proper staff machine to translate it into plans, it is certain that we could have intervened in the eastern Mediterranean long before the Germans could have brought their forces to bear. Sir Edward Grey argues in his book that the Germans were on interior lines and could thus frustrate all diversions. But this was not true of Turkey in this period of the war. On the contrary, its untruth was the key to all the German perturbation. They could not aid Turkey for many months. Amphibious power could strike Turkey in a few weeks. Our war direction was not, however, upon that level. We have seen what struggles were called for from Hindenburg and Ludendorff. supported though they were by Conrad, by the whole influence of Austria and by the German Chancellor, to procure the transference of the war effort to the East, and only with what compromises they had succeeded. For all the power of the Admiralty, we could only use arguments. We could not display the laurels of a naval Tannenberg. There was no supreme authority in London, as in Berlin, to say aye or no, right or left, west or east. It was only one man's opinion against another's. Still, from this moment the politicians on the War Council looked mainly to the east. While Sir John French and the British Army headquarters fought desperately and naturally to have every man, gun and shell in France, Lord Kitchener, with ever-changing mind, was the battleground of these contentions. Sometimes one side prevailed with him and then again the other. There can be no doubt that if the Easterners had only to deal with the British Army and its headquarters staff, we could have given them orders. But behind Sir John French and Sir Henry Wilson towered the mighty authority of General Joffre, victor of the Marne. Joffre, like Falkenhayn, looked only to the Western Front, and like Falkenhayn believed in the superiority of the attack. There alone, in his judgment, as in that of his opponent, lay in 1915 the decision of the war. Each was sure that he had only to gather a few more army corps and a few more cannon to break the opposing line and march triumphantly, as the case might be, to Paris or to the Rhine. They were, of course, as we now know, absolutely out of touch with the true facts and values. Neither of them, nor their expert advisers, had ever sufficiently realized the blunt truth, quite obvious to common soldiers, that bullets kill men. Against such an incubus we could make no headway. Every time Lord Kitchener was persuaded to the east, where indeed his instincts led him, and measures were taken in that direction, Joffre, with the French government working collaterally through the Foreign Office, descended upon him, so that he swung to and fro like a buoy in a tide stream. Lots of people would no doubt have done the same. It must also be remembered that the British Empire was only at this time a subsidiary factor in the land war. France had ceded to us the decisive control of naval affairs, and some declared that it was our duty, after expressing our views, to conform to the military guidance of the chiefs of the great and heroic army at whose side our forces, only as yet a tenth as strong, were contending. As Lord Kitchener observed after one heart-shaking discussion, "We cannot make war as we ought. We can only make it as we can."